There are moments in life that freeze you in your tracks, not because you're confused, but because what you're witnessing is so impossibly stupid, your brain just refuses to believe it. That was me, barefoot in my driveway at 7 a.m., coffee mug shattering on the pavement as I watched a massive hook clamp down on the chrome bumper of my 1967 Shelby GT500. The tow truck operator was whistling like he was harvesting corn. I screamed. He waved. I bolted toward him, yelling that he was stealing a literal museum piece. He shrugged and said, "Talk to Karen." And just like that, the engine of a $500,000 Heritage vehicle groaned under tension as it was dragged up a steel ramp, hood first, by the HOA president's personal vendetta. My hands were still shaking when I called the museum curator, who answered with, "Please tell me you're calling to confirm the parade time." I replied, "We have a problem. A very blonde, HOA-shaped problem." Karen wasn't even subtle about it. She had parked her golf cart right in front of my driveway, sipping from a mug that said, "I run this block." I'd lived in this neighborhood for 10 years without ever getting more than a warning for leaving my trash bins out too long. But Karen had moved in 6 months ago and somehow risen to the top of the HOA food chain through charm, passive aggression, and a suspicious number of absentee ballots. She was the kind of person who once cited a neighbor for planting too cheerful of a flower bed. The kind of person who emailed the entire community that my car, which had been polished to a mirror shine and parked for a single night, was bringing down property values with its dated aesthetic. I tried to reason with the tow driver. I told him the car wasn't just classic, it was protected. It was on official loan from the National Heritage Auto Collection. It was scheduled to be the centerpiece of a veterans parade in less than 48 hours. He looked at me like I was reading conspiracy theories off a cereal box. "Look, man," he said, "I just got the order." I asked him if it was signed by a city official. He shook his head and pulled a crumpled paper from his dashboard. HOA President Karen Johnson. That was it. No license, no city stamp, no legal authority. Just her signature, next to a checkbox labeled, "Nuisance Removal." As I stood there gaping, Karen walked up, flanked by 2 other HOA board members, neither of whom I'd ever seen at a meeting. She had that smile people wear when they think they've already won. "That car's been sitting here since last night," she said sweetly, as though explaining things to a child. "It violates Section 14C of our visual presentation standards." I told her it was a federally protected asset. She said, "It's still ugly." The crowd that had gathered murmured uncomfortably. One neighbor tried to object, but Karen turned on her heel and muttered something about them needing to cut their hedges. They backed off. The tow truck roared and pulled away, my Shelby dragging slightly at an angle because the driver hadn't secured the wheels properly. I could hear metal scraping the edge of the truck's bed. That sound, it wasn't just heartbreaking, it was illegal. I wanted to throw something, but all I had was a broken mug and a heart rate climbing past safe limits. I went inside and immediately called the museum. Curator Thomas Miller was not a man you wanted to disappoint. He was ex-military, retired historian, and classic car savant all rolled into one. When I told him what happened, there was a long pause on the other end. "She towed it?" he asked slowly. "Straight off my driveway. No warning, no ticket. Just a golf cart and an attitude. Do you know where they took it? Impound lot, I think. Probably the one on Fairmont Avenue." "Good," he said, suddenly much more formal. "Don't go alone. I'm alerting the Office of Historic Preservation. This is not just theft. This is federal tampering." It didn't fully hit me until I ended the call. Karen hadn't just inconvenienced me. She had interfered with a national loan agreement. And given the contract I had signed, complete with photos, documentation, and GPS logging, this wasn't going to just blow over. There were penalties, serious ones, legal ones, and not for me. I grabbed my car keys to head to the impound lot, but before I could start the engine, there was a knock at the door. It was my neighbor, Jess, who lived 2 houses down and ran a local autoblog. She had her phone out and was already filming. "This is going viral," she said. "I posted the tow video 10 minutes ago. It's already on r/EntitledPeople." I blinked. "What video?" She showed me. Karen smugly sipping coffee while pointing at my car, the tow truck dragging it with a crunching noise, and me sprinting barefoot across the lawn. Jess grinned. "You're the internet's newest hero. Also, you might want to wear shoes next time." That night, I barely slept. The museum emailed me an official statement saying they were preparing legal action. I sent them everything I had, photos, timestamps, even the signed HOA newsletter that Karen had edited last month to include new vehicle appearance standards no one else had voted on. The kicker? The original bylaws didn't even mention classic cars. By morning, news trucks were rolling down the block. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Her golf cart was parked crookedly across 2 guest spaces near the clubhouse, but her house was dark. I got ready, suited up, and drove straight to the impound yard. I didn't know what I'd find, but I knew one thing for sure: Karen had towed the wrong car. And she was about to find out just how much horsepower was in a legal engine fired up by federal outrage. The impound lot looked like the aftermath of a demolition derby. Faded cars sat in haphazard rows, some missing doors, others with cracked windows and hoods bent like paper. The chain-link fence screeched open as I approached the front desk, holding a printed letter from the National Heritage Auto Collection in one hand and a thick folder of documentation in the other. The guy behind the glass window barely looked up until I slid the museum letter across the counter. He raised an eyebrow, then took his sweet time reading it, flipping through each page like he was deciphering a treasure map. Finally, he exhaled through his nose and muttered, "Yeah, that one's in the back, but, you might want to take a deep breath." I didn't take a breath. I stormed through the lot until I reached the back, where my Shelby sat crooked and dirty, resting between 2 rusted-out pickup trucks like a fallen king surrounded by imposters. The once glimmering paint was smeared with greasy handprints. The front spoiler had been cracked. The leather interior, restored by hand over 3 years, was exposed to the elements because someone had left the window down. It looked like someone had actually sat inside it while eating a burrito. I stared for a long time, fists clenched, trying to suppress the wave of rage rising in my chest. I took pictures from every angle, careful to capture timestamps and GPS coordinates, and then called the curator again. Thomas didn't answer right away. When he finally picked up, his tone was clipped and furious. "They left the window down?" he barked. I confirmed it. "You document every inch. And do not, under any circumstances, drive it. We're sending a flatbed with an inspector and a federal agent. This is no longer about HOA stupidity. This is artifact abuse." Back at home, Karen had started damage control. She'd sent out an HOA-wide email titled "Clarifying Our Community Standards," which was nothing short of a manifesto. It claimed I had parked an unregistered, non-functional vehicle in a high-visibility zone, and that she was merely enforcing a long-ignored regulation. The email was laced with phrases like "protecting property values" and "consistent neighborhood aesthetics," but her tone reeked of desperation. The best part? She included a fabricated photograph of the Shelby with trash piled on it, clearly Photoshop. Someone in the community quickly noticed the trash can shadow didn't even match the car's lighting. Within minutes, a screenshot of her email was circulating online, with captions like "Karen's Photoshop crimes," and "She tried to frame a Shelby." I didn't need to respond. The internet did it for me. Car forums picked up the story. A YouTuber who specializes in car restorations made a 10-minute breakdown video titled "Karen Destroys Protected Mustang, Gets Owned by the Feds." By the next morning, the video had 500,000 views. The comments were ruthless. People had started calling her "Tow Truck Karen," and someone even made a parody HOA newsletter featuring a photoshopped image of Karen towing the Statue of Liberty. By midday, the flatbed arrived, along with a sharply dressed federal agent named Agent Ruiz and a woman from the museum's artifact preservation team. They were both professional and calm, but their silence as they examined the car spoke volumes. Ruiz took notes while the preservationist snapped photos and shook her head repeatedly. The tow yard manager came out halfway through, asking if he needed a lawyer. Ruiz told him to wait by the gate and not say a word. I wasn't even angry at the lot staff anymore. They'd followed what they thought was a legitimate directive. But Karen? She had crossed a line that didn't just involve local bylaws. She had wandered into federal jurisdiction with the grace of a marching band in a minefield. That afternoon, I got a call from a neighbor named Barry, who worked in real estate and had always avoided HOA politics. His voice was low, cautious. "Hey, just thought you should know. Karen called an emergency board meeting. Said it's about an unfortunate misunderstanding. She's spinning it as you being hostile and trying to intimidate her." I thanked him and asked if I could attend. "Oh, you'll want to," he said. "Because the whole board's finally realizing she's nuts." I showed up at the clubhouse that evening wearing a plain black polo and holding my folder of legal documents like a trophy. Half the neighborhood was already seated, murmuring. The room buzzed with tension. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by two members who looked like they regretted every decision that had led them to this moment. She stood up to speak and launched into a speech about how she was simply trying to restore balance and order to the neighborhood. She talked about safety, aesthetics, and community harmony. It might have worked if she hadn't doubled down and called the Shelby a piece of obsolete junk. I didn't say a word. I just handed a copy of the Federal Museum Agreement to every board member. Then I played a voicemail I'd received earlier from Thomas, stating clearly that the museum was pressing charges for unauthorized removal and damage to a protected exhibit. One board member turned white. Another covered her mouth in shock. Karen looked like she was trying to keep her face from twitching. Someone in the back raised their hand and asked, "Wait, so you towed a federal artifact without checking first?" Karen tried to explain, but it came out as stammering. That's when Agent Ruiz walked in, flanked by the preservationist, and calmly asked to speak with the board in private. The room went dead silent. Karen's face drained of all color. She stood up, stumbling slightly, and followed them into the back office. The door clicked shut. We could still hear the muffled sound of Agent Ruiz's voice. Nobody else said a word. Everyone just sat there, watching the door like it might explode. 15 minutes later, Ruiz exited alone. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said to the room. "We'll be in contact." Karen didn't come out. The next morning, a notice was posted on the community bulletin board. It read, "Effective immediately, Karen Johnson has been suspended from all HOA duties pending investigation. Vice President Doris Mayfield will assume interim leadership." I stood there reading it, sipping coffee from a new mug that said, "Ask me about my classic car." I didn't need to say anything. Not anymore. The wheels of justice were turning, and Karen was strapped to the axle. Karen resurfaced 2 days later like a bad sequel nobody asked for. Except this time, she wasn't strutting down the sidewalk or giving disapproving glances at mailbox height. She was skulking around in oversized sunglasses, wearing a floppy hat and walking her schnauzer as if doing so would erase the events of the past week. But the damage was done. The community had turned. The once untouchable self-appointed queen of the HOA was now being avoided like the last deviled egg at a potluck. Her name had become a punchline, her voice barely heard above the whispers and snickers that followed her wherever she went. And yet, instead of retreating with even a shred of humility, Karen did what Karens do best. She doubled down. That morning, I found an envelope taped to my front door. It wasn't an apology. It was a letter typed in Comic Sans. Yes, Comic Sans, accusing me of public defamation, slanderous behavior, and contributing to a hostile environment. According to Karen, I owed her a public apology for making the HOA look bad in front of federal agents. She even demanded that I issue a retraction video explaining that the entire incident was a simple misunderstanding. I stared at the paper for a full minute before laughing so hard I scared a squirrel off the porch. I didn't respond. I forwarded it to Thomas at the museum and also sent it to my lawyer, just in case Karen had completely lost her grip on reality, which at this point was a reasonable assumption. What she didn't know was that the towing company had started cooperating with federal investigators. They handed over their call logs, email chains, and internal notes, and in doing so exposed a massive problem for Karen. The tow request form she submitted wasn't just unauthorized, it had been modified. The original form from the HOA website didn't even have a historic vehicle category, yet the one Karen gave the company did. She had edited the document herself and added a fake clause about vehicles over 30 years old requiring removal within 24 hours of notice. That clause didn't exist in any version of the HOA bylaws. When the investigator asked how the towing company verified its legitimacy, they responded, "We've worked with her before. We thought she was the legal authority." The news spread like gasoline on dry brush. Screenshots of the forged forms hit Reddit. Car blogs started publishing updates. One site titled their article, "Karen Forges HOA Forms, Declares War on Mustang." Another called her the Community Dictator of the Year. People were tagging the National Heritage Auto Collection in comments, asking for updates and offering donations to restore the car. A parody Twitter account named at HOA KarenWatch began posting fake HOA memos like, "All grass must be exactly 2.3 inches tall," or "face deportation." My neighborhood had gone from quiet suburbia to international meme in under a week, and Karen was now more infamous than any viral raccoon or exploding lawn mower. Then came the lawyers. Thomas and his legal team weren't playing around. They filed a formal complaint with the city's Historic Preservation Office and served Karen with a notice of intent to sue for artifact damage and misrepresentation of legal authority. The claim was precise and brutal. Estimated restoration costs, $47,000. Emotional damages for canceling the Veterans Parade Showcase, $20,000. Federal artifact interference penalties, pending. The paperwork alone was thick enough to use as a doorstop. Karen tried one last trick. She held an emergency town hall in the community center and invited only her most loyal supporters, most of whom had stopped supporting her days ago. I showed up anyway, sitting in the back with crossed arms while she nervously paced in front of a PowerPoint titled, "Restoring Peace and Order." Her speech was a mess. She started by blaming outsiders, then accused the museum of exploiting the situation for media attention. She even claimed she'd always had the community's best interest at heart, and that the car looked abandoned and unsafe. When someone asked why she hadn't just asked me to move it, she fumbled her notes and said, "Well, I mean, he wasn't approachable. He has tools in his garage." That was when my neighbor Jess stood up, holding a printout of Karen's forged towing document. She asked point blank, "Did you write this, Karen?" Karen paused, blinked, then said, "I may have adjusted the language to better reflect the spirit of our community." The room collectively winced. That's when Doris, the interim HOA president, announced she had contacted the HOA's insurance company. The rep confirmed that because Karen had acted outside her authority, she would be personally liable for any damages awarded in court. Silence followed. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Karen sat down without another word. Her dog barked once and then fell quiet, as if sensing his owner's reign had come to an end. I stood, nodded at Doris, and left the room without saying anything else. There was nothing left to say. The next day, a moving truck showed up at Karen's house. No one knew if she was leaving permanently or just trying to avoid service of process. The irony, of course, was that the same towing company she had used was now hauling away her patio furniture. A neighbor later told me she stood in the driveway yelling, "Be careful with that. It's antique. I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried." By the weekend, the museum released an official statement thanking the public for their support and confirming that restoration work on the Shelby had begun. They also announced the car would be displayed at a special exhibition titled Preserved Through Persistence: The Untold Stories of American Automotive Heritage. I was invited to cut the ribbon. Karen wasn't invited at all. The neighborhood felt different now. People smiled more. The HOA meetings had record attendance. Even Barry from real estate cracked a joke about naming the next community picnic after me. "We could call it Mustang Days," he said, holding up a burger. I chuckled, but deep down I knew something had shifted permanently. We'd taken back our block. Not with rage or revenge, but with facts, law, and a chrome-plated piece of history that roared louder than any HOA president ever could. The courthouse smelled like old paper, coffee, and panic. Karen walked in flanked by her attorney, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 2 weeks. Her heels clicked against the tile floor like a slow countdown to her own personal judgment day. She wore a beige pantsuit, probably in some desperate attempt to appear professional, but her stiff posture and twitching eye gave her away. Meanwhile, I sat calmly near the front, next to Thomas from the museum and a representative from the Historic Preservation Office. Behind us sat a row of veterans in their parade uniforms, each one a reminder of the event Karen had nearly ruined. One of them, a retired Air Force mechanic, gave me a silent nod of solidarity. I returned it. This wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about principle. And everyone in that courtroom knew it. The judge entered, a stern woman with sharp eyes and a subtle Mustang lapel pin on her robe. I didn't know whether that was coincidence or karma throwing me a bone, but I wasn't about to complain. Court was called into session, and the bailiff read out the charges against Karen. Civil liability for damage to a federally protected museum artifact. Fraudulent modification of official HOA document. Unlawful impersonation of authority. The room was dead silent, aside from the scribble of pens and the occasional nervous cough. Karen's attorney tried to motion for dismissal, claiming she acted in good faith, but the judge wasn't having it. She wanted to hear everything. And we had everything. The prosecution started by laying out the timeline of events. They showed photos of the car before and after the tow. They introduced the museum loan contract, signed and verified. They played the voicemail from Thomas, the one where he said flatly that the Shelby was scheduled for display and protected under federal artifacts status. Then came the documents Karen had submitted to the towing company. The doctored HOA bylaws with a clause that didn't exist. The digital signature matched her email. The metadata showed it had been created on her laptop. Her defense argued it was an administrative oversight. The judge didn't even try to hide her smirk. Then it was my turn to testify. I walked to the stand, adjusted the mic, and told the court exactly what had happened. I spoke about the morning of the tow, how the operator shrugged and said, "Talk to Karen," how I called the museum in a panic, and how their first response wasn't confusion, but legal escalation. I explained the value of the car, not just in dollars but in heritage. I talked about the veterans who were supposed to see it, many of whom had worked on that very model during service. The courtroom remained silent throughout, save for the quiet sniffling of one veteran's wife in the back row. When I finished, I locked eyes with Karen. Her stare didn't hold long. The museum's preservationist took the stand next and went through the damage report line by line. Leather interior exposed to sun damage. Scratches on the fenders. Undercarriage misalignment. A total of $47,000 in restoration work. The judge flipped through the printed report and frowned. Then the tow yard manager testified. He admitted he assumed Karen's documents were real because she had dealt with them before. He looked genuinely remorseful. When the judge asked if he would ever take an HOA order again without legal verification, he said, "Absolutely not." Lesson learned. Karen's defense tried to pivot. They argued the vehicle was parked in violation of community guidelines, that it was unregistered locally, and that Karen had simply acted to preserve the neighborhood's visual standards. But the prosecution tore that apart. They presented the actual HOA bylaws. No rule prohibited classic vehicles, especially not temporarily parked for a national event. Then came the kicker. The HOA insurance provider had submitted a statement distancing themselves from Karen entirely. They confirmed her actions were unsanctioned, and any damages would fall solely on her, not the association. The judge called for closing argument. Karen's lawyer begged for leniency, citing stress, community pressure, and poor judgment. The prosecution calmly asked the court to hold Karen accountable for the consequences of her deception and negligence. When the judge recessed for deliberation, the tension in the courtroom felt like static before a lightning strike. No one moved. Karen sat frozen, her attorney whispering urgently in her ear. Meanwhile, the veterans behind me shared war stories and compared Mustang models, unfazed by the wait. I realized, in that moment, I was surrounded by people who had survived far worse than HOA tyranny. They were here because they believed in honoring something: integrity, history, and, apparently, internal combustion. The judge returned faster than expected. She didn't bother with a long preamble. She ruled that Karen was fully liable for all damages to the vehicle, including the restoration and legal costs. She also mandated that Karen be fined for the falsification of documents and sentenced her to 150 hours of community service, to be performed at the very museum she tried to undermine. She would be supervised closely while assisting with cleaning and maintenance of historic vehicles. The courtroom erupted, not in cheers but in restrained, satisfied nods. The kind of victory that doesn't need volume. Karen stood there, stunned. Her lips moved but no sound came out. Her lawyer patted her arm like he was comforting someone who just got evicted from their own dream. The veterans filed out in silence, dignified. Thomas turned to me and said, "We'll restore the car, but that verdict, that was justice." Outside the courthouse, the media had gathered again. Reporters asked for statements. I kept it short. The car will roll again. Thanks to everyone who stood up for what mattered. Back home, the mood had shifted permanently. Neighbors waved. One kid had drawn the Shelby in chalk on the sidewalk and labeled it, "Hero Car." Jess brought over homemade cookies shaped like Mustangs. The HOA had officially removed Karen from the board. Her house went up for sale the next day. A new era had begun, one where people read the bylaws and checked their power at the sidewalk. The court ruling wasn't just about one car. It was a reminder that history isn't something you erase with a tow truck. It's something you preserve, protect, and, sometimes, rebuild with chrome, sweat, and truth. The restoration took nearly 3 months, and every single day of it felt like watching a war hero being slowly pieced back together. The museum's preservation team worked tirelessly, sourcing authentic parts, hand-stitching interior replacements, and removing every trace of Karen's careless destruction. I visited the facility weekly, watching as the car gradually returned to its former glory. Gone were the greasy smudges and scratched paint. In their place stood gleaming chrome, fresh polish so deep you could see your soul in it, and a restored growl in the engine that vibrated through your chest. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a symbol, a monument to persistence, a survivor of suburban sabotage. Thomas kept me updated throughout, and in one call, he mentioned the museum was planning something special for the reveal. They wanted a grand reopening event, a proper public ceremony, and they asked if I would be willing to drive the Shelby through the gates as part of the celebration. I couldn't answer right away. It was overwhelming. To think that something I'd protected on loan would now be immortalized by the very people who preserved America's automotive legacy. It felt surreal. I finally said yes and immediately started prepping. Not just the logistics but the weight of the moment. This wasn't just closure. It was a victory lap. The event was held on a Saturday, and the crowd showed up in numbers that surprised even the museum staff. Classic car enthusiasts filled the lot. News vans lined the perimeter. A group of local veterans arrived in formation, dressed in uniforms and holding flags, some of them the same men who had been scheduled to see the car in the parade before Karen's intervention. People wore shirts that read "Respect History" and "Don't Mess with Mustangs." The entire area buzzed with anticipation. You could feel it in the air like the hum of an engine about to start. The Shelby waited behind a curtain of velvet rope, polished so meticulously that every inch reflected the sky. When I finally climbed into the driver's seat, I took a moment to let it settle in. The wheel felt familiar, like shaking hands with an old friend. The ignition turned, and the engine roared to life, not a scream, but a low, proud growl that drew gasps from the crowd. The curtain dropped, and I slowly rolled forward through the archway as cameras clicked and people clapped. The veterans saluted. Some of them teared up. I spotted Jess in the crowd, recording everything with her phone while wiping her eyes with a napkin. Thomas greeted me at the stage with a handshake that turned into a hug. He said something to the audience about resilience and responsibility, then handed me a small plaque that read, "In gratitude for the preservation of American heritage." I didn't know what to say. I just held it up and let the moment speak for itself. The museum announced a new feature exhibit centered around the incident titled, "The Car That Karen Towed," blending humor with a powerful message about stewardship and community. The Shelby would be the star of the show, displayed alongside documents, court footage, and even a small section dedicated to internet memes that helped raise awareness. It was history preserved twice. Karen, of course, was nowhere near the event. Rumor had it she was now living in a condo 3 towns over, her HOA privileges revoked, her social circle shattered. Her required community service at the museum had started earlier that week. Multiple staff members told me she'd been assigned to cleaning hubcaps and polishing old gear shifters under strict supervision. One in turn joked that she spent more time scrubbing than speaking. Apparently, she had requested a transfer to another department and had been firmly denied. It wasn't about humiliation, it was about learning. And maybe, just maybe, about humility. Life in the neighborhood returned to something better than normal. The HOA board had turned over, and Doris ran meetings like a public town hall instead of a royal decree. People started planting flowers again without fear of a citation. Kids rode their bikes freely. One neighbor even bought a classic car of his own, a cherry red '69 Camaro, which he parked proudly in his driveway, daring anyone to say a word. Nobody did. The street felt alive again, not in rebellion, but in celebration. A silent understanding echoed between every neighbor: we'd survived a Karen and come out stronger. One afternoon, while cleaning the garage, I found the original copy of the museum's loan agreement, the one I'd nearly lost when Karen made her play. I framed it and hung it above my tool wall, not just as a reminder of what we'd fought for, but as proof that even when someone misuses power, the truth can and does rise up to challenge it. Every wrench I turned afterward carried a different weight. Every engine I worked on felt like part of a bigger picture. Cars weren't just machines. They were markers of time, of sacrifice, of craftsmanship that deserved more than HOA pettiness. Months later, I got an email from the museum. They were launching a national campaign on preservation awareness, and they wanted to use the Shelby as their flagship story. Thomas asked if I'd be willing to tour with the car, stopping at schools, veteran centers, and local car shows across the country. I said yes without hesitation. The idea of sharing the story, not just of a car but of standing up for what matters, felt more important than ever. The first tour stop was a high school in the next county. After my short speech, a teenager approached me and said, "So, you really beat the HOA?" I laughed and told him, I didn't beat them. I just didn't let them lie their way into rewriting the rules. He nodded and replied, "That's awesome. I'm gonna write about this for my civics project." And that was it. The real victory. Not just getting the car back, not just watching Karen get held accountable, but knowing the story had become something more. A lesson passed on. a warning preserved in chrome. A reminder that history doesn't belong to people who try to erase it out of convenience. It belongs to those who respect it, protect it, and sometimes have to fight for it, one tow truck disaster at a time.